look you in the eyes. You're just like an angel, and your skin makes me cry. And you float like a feather in a beautiful world. You're so very special. I wish I was special.
Good evening, live from Minsk. Tonight is November 16th and this is From the Other Side, live show 154, Gold, Guns and Gravity. And tonight we're tracing the real shape of global power and how it's shifting beneath the surface faster than governments, media or markets are willing to admit. You're going to see the connective tissue between economics, warfare, sovereignty and technology, because none of these things happen in isolation anymore. We're going to open up with something subtle but seismic, the global movement of gold. Not headlines, not speculation, but physical bullion leaving Western vaults and being locked down inside new sovereign facilities across Eurasia. This isn't nostalgia, it's not symbolism, it's the early architecture of a parallel financial order. From there we move to Britain's economic strain, promises made louder than the balance sheet that has to pay for them. Then zoom out to Europe's self-sabotage, where ideology replaced industrial strategy and asset sieges replaced diplomacy. We'll step back into history, to the dream of a common European home that never was allowed to exist, and how NATO quietly absorbed the entire operating system of European diplomacy. Then we'll shift to the battlefield, open fields, collapsing lines, and why the fall of key logistic hubs in Ukraine is reshaping not just the military map, but the political futures of the EU, the UK, and NATO itself. Across the Atlantic, we'll look at America's imperialism momentum while Washington keeps drifting towards conflict, even as the domestic political and economic foundation is fracturing. And finally, we'll end where geopolitics meets physics. Limitless range, nuclear weapons and underwater doomsday drones that make missile defense a fantasy and restore deterrence on terms politicians cannot spin. And of course, at the very end, before the outro, we'll come home to a complete different kind of domination. Dynamo Minsk's 7-0 demolition of Siberia at Minsk Arena. So stay with us, share the stream, and let's begin. Let's start with one thing that doesn't lie: gold. Right now we are witnessing a movement the Western financial system did not expect, did not plan for, and cannot reverse. Nations withdrawing their physical bullion from Western vaults and storing it inside their own borders, quietly, methodically, and with unmistakable intent. This isn't about price. This isn't about inflation hedging. This is about sovereignty. For decades, countries held their gold in London or New York because these places were seen as safe, neutral, and legally reliable. But that trust collapsed the moment the Western froze $300 billion worth of Russian sovereign reserves. And every finance ministry, every central bank, every intelligence service across the global south made the same note. If they can freeze Russia's reserves, they can freeze ours. Germany brought its gold home. Hungary brought its gold home. Turkey brought its gold home. Venezuela demanded its gold back. Serbia increased its reserves. China and Russia continue mass accumulation. But now something is even more symbolic, even more strategic has happened. Kazakhstan has completed construction of a 1,000-ton gold vault, the largest in its history, with hardened security, state control, and explicit purpose to repatriate all Kazakh gold and potentially store the gold of its regional partners. So think about that. A small landlocked nation between Russia and China preparing to become a gold storage hub for the entire Eurasian network. This is no longer a national project. It's the quiet foundation of a parallel monetary system. A system outside SWIFT, outside Euroclear, outside US custody, outside sanctions. This is how the new orders began, not with declarations, but with vaults. But history warns us, when a nation challenges the existing financial hierarchy, pushback follows. De Gaulle demanded gold for dollars in 1960s, soon after France erupted in the 1968 uprisings. Coincidence? Possibly. Convenient timing? Definitely. And today, Kazakhstan finds itself right on the schedule, under intense scrutiny from Western NGOs, media freedom groups, election monitors, and human rights organizations. It's the same playbook used in color revolutions. It's the same pressure applied to states stepping outside Western control. Kazakhstan has over 300,000 foreign-funded NGOs. 3 previous governments were toppled through uprisings. Now they assert gold sovereignty. Destabilization narratives are already forming. Because gold held abroad is leverage, gold held at home is independence. This movement, quiet, technical, seemingly small, is the beginning of a large fracture. The end of blind trust in Western custodianship, the rise of regional financial sovereignty, the return of gold as geopolitical insurance. And of course that leads us directly to a country that once mastered global finance and now struggles to finance its own promises. Britain is trapped in the oldest dilemma of declining powers. Big rhetoric, small wallet. Let's talk about the contradiction nobody in Westminster wants to address. Britain has positioned itself as Ukraine's most loyal European backer, promising unlimited support, ambitious defence expansions and global leadership. But here's the truth. The UK cannot afford the foreign policy it's advertising. Britain's economy is stagnant, productivity is down, growth is weak, inflation keeps biting, public services are collapsing, and the population is exhausted. Yet London continues announcing dramatic commitments: 5% of GP on defence by 2035, 2.5% on core defence by 2027, billions more for Ukraine, billions more for NATO, billions more for new weapon systems. It's unsustainable. 62.2 billion in defence spending this year, 73.5 billion projected, 13 billion already committed to Ukraine. Meanwhile, GDP growth in 2025, 0.7% in quarter 1, 0.3% in quarter 2. The government talks Churchill, the economy whispers IMF. Bond markets are nervous, yields are rising, the pound hovering around 1.31 is unsustainable. And let's tell the truth, the media won't touch. A surge in gold to over $4,300 is a vote of no confidence in the Western fiat currencies, including the pound. And inside Britain, public patience is evaporating. People are worn down by a cost of living pressure, rising taxes, high energy bills, waiting lists, immigration strain, declining infrastructure. Support for Ukraine exists, but it's passive. Habit, not enthusiasm. Foreign policy has run ahead of economic reality, and eventually reality always wins. But the UK isn't alone. Europe has experienced the same imbalance between ideology and capacity, but at a continental scale. Europe's crisis is not primarily Russian, not primarily Chinese, not even primarily American. Europe's crisis is European, self-curated, self-reinforcing, self-inflicted. Let's start with the biggest financial scandal of modern times, though Europe refuses to call it that: the freezing and proposed seizure of Russian sovereign assets. Not private money, not oligarch money, not sanctioned individuals, state reserves, $300 billion. Some of it already earning profit for the EU, the rest being eyed for confiscation. This broke the world's trust, not because of sympathy for Russia, because of fear. If Europe can seize the reserves of a G20 member, what stops it seizing anyone else's? The US has pulled back from participating. Japan refuses. Belgium's own Prime Minister is against it. But Brussels marches on. This single decision accelerated de-dollarization, de-euroization, BRICS expansion, non-Western reserve diversification, global gold accumulation, non-SWIFT settlements networks. Nobody wants their national reserves at risk because of European politics. Then there's Europe's second self-wound, joining the US tech war against China. The Netherlands seized Nexperia, a Chinese-owned semiconductor firm. China retaliated by cutting off wafers. Germany's automotive industry, Mercedes, Volkswagen, Audi, is already slowing production. This is on top of early self-destruction, cutting off cheap Russian gas. Energy-intensive industries, metallurgy, chemicals, fertilizers, foundries cannot operate competitively with triple or quadruple energy costs. BASF left, aluminium plants shut, steel mills idle, small manufacturers collapse. Europe replaced energy security with moral posturing, and now it imports gas at 3 times the cost, while the US enjoys industrial reshoring. The Eurozone's structural flaws magnify this: austerity ceilings, no sovereign monetary flexibility, export dependency, a financialized elite disconnected from industrial reality. Europe is becoming poorer, less industrial, more dependent, more compliant. And all this sits on top of a diplomatic system that was broken long before Ukraine. There was a moment, brief, fragile, when Europe could have redesigned its security architecture around competition rather than confrontation. It was called the Common European Home, an OSCE-led vision of equal security, mutual respect, and dialogue with Russia as a partner, not a problem. But that vision died early, not by accident, by design. The US insisted NATO remain the core of European security. The EU accepted it. The OSCE was sidelined. NATO expanded eastward, not for security, but for alignment. EU foreign policy became secondary to NATO strategy. Eventually, something remarkable and dangerous happened. NATO became the operating system for European diplomacy. Foreign ministers met in NATO format in the morning, then repeated the same positions in the EU in the afternoon. Europe forgot how to mediate, how to negotiate, how to de-escalate. The only acceptable language became deterrence, sanctions, unity, alignment, escalation. And the OSCE, the only inclusive platform with Russia, was defunded, ignored, sidelined, even during crises. Thus, when the Ukraine crisis escalated, Europe no longer had a diplomatic mechanism capable of stopping it. The result? No Minsk enforcement, no OS. CE revival, no neutrality negotiations, no pressure on compromise. Just more NATO, more weapons, more sanctions, and no plan for de-escalation. This wasn't inevitable, it was chosen. And now Europe is discovering that when diplomacy dies, the battlefield controls the politics, not the other way around. War doesn't move linearly. War moves geometrically. And now the geometry in eastern Ukraine is changing faster than Western governments can adjust. Let's focus on Pokrovsk, because that was the tipping point. Pokrovsk is not just a dot on the map, it's a central logistics hub, the keystone of Ukraine's entire defensive belt. Its fall means reinforcements slowed, lateral movement restricted, supply lines elongated, counterattacks weakened, the belt stretched thin. And beyond Pokrovsk, open fields, flat land, mineral, natural defense. Once the front enters this terrain, a breakthrough can turn into a collapse. If Russian forces maintain momentum here, the road to the river becomes accessibly in a way Western planners said would never happen. For years, the unspoken Western strategy was keep Russia away from the river and Odessa at all costs. That strategy is now at risk. Meanwhile, Ukraine's strikes on Russian refineries, though spectacular on camera, have limited strategic effect. No fuel shortages, no queues, no systematic disruption. In contrast, Russia's attacks on Ukrainian thermal generation are decisive. These aren't punitive, they are preparatory. Darken the rear, exhaust infrastructure, strain logistics, then manoeuvre. Europe faces unbearable dilemma. To escalate risks a NATO-Russia war. To de-escalate is political humiliation. To continue at current levels is unsustainable. And when this war ends, whether sooner or later, Ukraine's reconstruction will likely be financed not by Europe, by Russia, China and the BRICS lenders. A Eurasian Ukraine, not a EU Ukraine. Europe bets everything on an outcome that is no longer realistic. Which brings us to where the Western response is ultimately shaped. Washington. In Washington, presidents campaign as if they're free agents, but the moment they enter office, they inherit an operating system, and that system has its own logic. 1. Always appear strong. 2. Never cede ground. 3. Maintain primacy. 4. Escalation is safer than restraint. Even presidents who openly oppose intervention end up continue it, like Trump, because the choices presented are pressure, sanctions, deterrence, or weakness. There is no diplomacy first option in this system. Meanwhile, the American public is entering a new phase of political consciousness. Housing is unaffordable. Healthcare is catastrophic. Utilities, childcare, transport, food, everything costs more. 2 incomes barely sustain a household. And Americans are asking, why are we paying for foreign wars when we're drowning at home? This is creating new coalitions. A right-wing anti-war faction, a left-wing economic populist faction, young voters deeply skeptical of Middle East entanglements, independents opposed to endless foreign commitments. And this vacuum rises a new foreign policy framework, return on investment geopolitics. In other words, if we're protecting you, what do we get? If we're funding this war, where's the benefit? If NATO needs defence, why don't Europeans pay more? Why are we subsidising global trade routes we don't use? This is transactional, brutally pragmatic, but unpredictable and unstable. It reflects multipolar reality but lacks institutional depth. And as the US oscillates between primacy and retrenchment, global systems collapse. Arms controls, UN peacekeeping, treaty frameworks, WTO authority, nuclear agreements, diplomatic norms. Into this void enters a new form of deterrence, one built on engineering, not politics. This October 2025 changed the strategic world. Russia successfully tested the Berezhnik nuclear-powered cruise missile. 15-plus hour flight time, 14,000-plus kilometers, subsonic stealth, unlimited range, unpredictable path, terrain following at ultra-low level. This is a weapon that can orbit the planet before striking. It nullifies radar horizons. It flies beneath the envelope of missile defense systems. At the same time, Russia advances the Poseidon underwater nuclear drone, nuclear-powered, unlimited underwater range, launchable from special submarines, up to 100 megaton warhead, designed to devastate coastal regions. Together, they form the unblockable deterrent pair. You cannot stop the air. You cannot stop the sea. These systems exist for one reason, to guarantee retaliation even Russia is struck first. And here's what Western leaders do not admit. There's no missile system capable of intercepting either of these weapons. Patriot, no. Aegis, no. THAAD, no. GMD, no. Space sensors, no. Lasers, no. All Western missile defense is built for ballistic arcs or predictable cruise paths. Berezhnik and Poseidon are designed to be unpredictable, invisible, and uncontestable. This restores the logic of mutual destruction, but with modern autonomy, modern propulsion, and modern stealth. Meanwhile, many Western analysts continue discussing Russia as a fading power, a backward state, a military failure. But these weapons prove one thing. Political narratives do not override physics. No empire survives on illusions. No alliance survives on denial. No missile shield survives against unlimited range nuclear propulsion. The lesson is simple. Deterrence still rules. Dialogue is the only stability. Missile defense cannot substitute for diplomacy, and the world is entering a phase where power is governed again, not by slogans, by engineering. And with that, let's close the geopolitics for tonight and come home to Minsk. Now, Dynamo Minsk update. Before we close tonight, a quick look at the ice here in Minsk, because Dynamo just delivered their biggest win of the season. On November 12th, the Bisons absolutely destroyed Siberia 7-0 at Minsk Arena, and I was there. Yusuf and Borakov both scored twice. Anas and Pinchuk ran the playmaking show, and Zach Foucault posted his 4th shutout of the year with calm, elite goaltending. It was dominance in every period, 2-0, 3-0, 2-0, and a clear message to the league. Dynamo is firing on all cylinders heading into winter. A perfect night for hockey in Minsk. And let's look at the goals.
Милошу. Вообще, все гештальты закрыли. Вот мы сегодня шутили. Это гол! Это гол!
Лайл. По синий перевод. Хенкель набрасывает. Подставление. Гол. Усов. 2-0. Эту десятку свою, да, которой не хватает до 1000 очков. Сократить Бориков. Подъем. Бориков. 3-0.
Кто так скажет?
Укали атаку начинает. Передача на Усова. Галиев. Бросок перед собой отбивает. Красоткин. Добивание. Гол. Усов. 4-0. Не удержал. Не остановил ее. Вошли снова в зону. Галиев. Прострел. 5-0. Вадим Мороз замыкает перед...
Команда Сибирь играет
Энос на пятак, и все-таки заходит. Виталий Пинчук.
23 у него уже есть в активе в этом сезоне. А у Максима Дорожко 4 игры на 0. И если сегодня Динамо не пропустит, то это Семен Бориков.
Шедевр. Вы посмотрите, как эта атака развивается.
And now, let's close out the show. And from dominance on the ice here in Minsk to something far less impressive abroad. While Dynamo is doing the real work in front of real fans, the Western-backed Belarusian opposition in exile has been busy collapsing under its own corruption and fantasy projects. A new investigation by Kit Clarensberg exposes exactly that. Let's walk through what he found. Now I want to turn to a story that hits very close to home here in Belarus, and that, frankly, almost no Western media is willing to touch honestly. I'm talking about the new investigation by Kit Clarensberg, published at the Grey Zone, into what's really been happening inside the EU and the US-backed Belarusian opposition structure around Svetlana Tizhnovskaya. And I call her Juanito Guaido, after Juan Guaido in Venezuela. You remember the narrative in 2020. She was sold to the West as the kind of modern Joan of Arc. The New York Times and others called her the rightful president of Belarus. Governments in Brussels, Washington and Vilnius rolled out the red carpet. She declared herself the head of the alternative government, claimed she'd won the election, and was immediately showered with funding, awards, medals, VIP treatment. But the leaks that Kit Clarensberg has obtained paint a very different picture behind the scenes. Corruption, fantasy projects, infighting, and total detachment from the real mood inside Belarus here. So let's walk through the highlights. So after fleeing to Lithuania in 2020, she didn't just do media tours. She set up what she called a United Transitional Cabinet, UTC, a government in waiting that would supposedly step in once Lukashenko was overthrown. That structure was heavily backed by Western institutions. And according to Clarensberg's piece, the European Endowment for Democracy, that's basically a European clone of the US National Endowment of Democracy, gave a secret grant with a clear goal. By the end of 2024, last year, the UTC should be recognized as the alternative government of Belarus, both inside the country and internationally. The plan was ambitious on paper. Build a parallel Exile government. Create a new national passport of New Belarus with international recognition. Draft a full strategy for democratic transition. A roadmap for transferring power from Minsk to Tizhnovskaya's team. Withdraw Belarus from all alliances with Russia and remove Russian bases and troops. Take a clear pro-EU, pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine line. So in other words, it wasn't just about democracy. It was about reorientating Belarus completely into the Western geopolitical camp. The problem? None of this matched what most Belarusians actually wanted here. Even Western polls showed that the majority of people in Belarus favor closer ties with Russia, not Brussels. And that's exactly why, back in 2020, Tikhanovskaya was careful not to sound openly anti-Russian. Her own coordination council said then there would be no radical foreign policy shift if she took power. But after the Ukraine war began, it all changed. At a big new Belarus conference in Warsaw in 2023, her so-called cabinet committed to EU membership, a separate new Belarus passport, cutting all alliances with Russia, backing Belarusian volunteers fighting for Ukraine. This might sound great in Brussels and Washington, but it's political suicide here in Belarus. Even Open Democracy, hardly a pro-Lukashenko outlet, warned that she was becoming out of touch and even irrelevant to the people on the ground. Everybody I've talked to here doesn't like her, and or she thinks she's a puppet of the West. And then we get to the core of the leaks. Kit Klarenberg exposes the new Belarus passport fiasco. The idea was to create an alternative passport under her authority, a kind of stateless travel document. It attracted a lot of media hype. European MPs called for it to be recognised, but internally it turned out to be a farce. Emails between her and her own foreign minister, Valery Kavalinsky, show a Lithuanian printing company tied to a businessman known as a Lukashenko's wallet was being lined up to print the passport. The draft design had basically blunders, calling it Republic of Belarus instead of simply Belarus, even drawing the Lithuanian border incorrectly so that Lithuanian territory appeared inside Belarus. Several countries that supposedly offered to help issue the passport, like Iceland and Lithuania, later reversed course. Kavalinsky, who was meant to be in charge, didn't even know where the money was or how the project was being financed. He complains in emails that he was told a Soros grant existed with money designated specifically for the passport, but she tells him there are no dedicated funds and that every expense needs separate approval from donors. He responds that this contradicts what he was told and that he had been informed the passport project would be financed from Belarusian funds so she could keep her grant for herself as much as possible. His words, not mine. He warns that money is disappearing into coordination that he has no visibility over. He essentially accuses her of treating what is supposed to be a state-level project like a private slush fund. She pushes back and pushes the blame back on him, saying he made conflicts with everyone and wasted a year. Eventually, after the last attempt to fix things, he resigns. He steps down from the very government in exile he helped to create. So where did we end up? In January this year, the new Belarus passport is finally issued, and not a single country on earth recognizes it. It can't be used for travel. It can't be used for officially anywhere. Even Lithuanian officials say it might be symbolic, nothing more. Then comes the second wave of scandals. Klarenberg's investigation points to a damning Norwegian audit of buy_help, a Belarusian opposition aid initiative closely linked to her circle, exposing forged receipts, missing invoices, sloppy data protection, and money not used as promised. Corruption, stealing money. Accusations against BYSOL leader Andrei Strakankov, can't say that, sorry I butchered it, of sexual harassment and threats against women who wanted to speak out. And finally the big one, the revelation that in August 2020 she herself took 15,000 euros from the Belarusian KGB in exchange for calling on protesters to stop and leaving the country. There's a video of her in that meeting, relaxed, joking with officials, calmly discussing her move to Vilnius. Compare that to her later BBC interview in 2025 where she painted a totally different picture. She said she was blackmailed, threatened, told her kids would suffer, given 20 minutes to pack. And in reality, as Klarenberg notes, her children had already been moved safely to Vilnius months earlier. So we have a Western manufacturer, Joan of Arc, whose internal government in exile is tearing itself apart. Flagship passport project is a joke. Associated NGOs are mired in financial and sexual misconduct scandals. And those journalists and whose own personal story of heroic resistance doesn't match what's on camera. And meanwhile, in Lithuania, which has spent around €1 million a year protecting her with VIP perks, security and a luxury residence, is now downgrading her status and asking her to vacate her state-provided house by this month, November. So what does that all tell us? First, that Kit Klarenberg's leak confirms what many people here in Belarus have sensed for years. This so-called government in exile is less a serious political alternative and more a Western-funded personality project with very little support inside the country. Second, that these regime change experiments are incredibly expensive. Hundreds of millions of dollars and euros have been poured into this structure, into offices, conferences, consultancies, passports that no one recognizes, and PR campaigns that have changed nothing here in Minsk. And third, and maybe most important, while real Belarusians, whatever their views on President Lukashenko, have to live with the consequences of sanctions, isolation and pressure, the people posing as their saviors abroad have been playing games with Western grant money and branding exercises. The big question now is, when this whole Jeffernoskaya project finally collapses, and it clearly is collapsing, will anyone in Brussels or Washington be held accountable for backing it, for wasting public money, for misreading Belarusian society, and for helping destroy whatever real organic opposition existed inside the country? Or will they just move to the next democracy hero and pretend this never happened? We'll keep following the story, and again, credit where credit is due. This material comes from the investigation by Kit Klarenberg of the Grey Zone. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. We began with gold, not just metal, but the return of sovereignty in a world that no longer trusts Western custodianship. We followed the thread into Britain's financial crisis and Europe's self-inflicted economic collapse, all while pretending to lead. We looked at the broken promise of the common European home and the battlefield reality now unfolding across open fields and collapsing red lines in Ukraine. We saw how the United States, still wide for empire, struggles to understand the multipolar reality it already lives in. And we ended with the truth that no press release can drown out. Russia now fields weapons with limitless range and no real counter. Deterrence is back, not as rhetoric, but as physics. And here in Belarus, we close with two realities. One on the ice, Dynamo Minsk, playing with unity, skill and precision, a real team with real results. And another, in exile, a collapsing Western-funded illusion exposed by Kit Klarenberg, burning through money, trust and credibility at the edge of irrelevance. This show is about seeing the world as it is, not as institutions, governments and media need you to believe it. And so, as always, thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing the stream. Thank you for supporting independent analysis here from Minsk. This has been From the Other Side, live show 154, Gold, Guns and Gravity. Good night from Minsk. Stay sharp, stay aware, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.